Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Solney, a contributor to Atlantic Live, and we are so glad all of you have joined us for the second day of our annual Atlantic Festival. Today's forum is going to cover an issue many of us have been thinking about and been concerned about during the pandemic, the plight of small businesses. The pandemic's economic devastation disproportionately impacted communities of color. But despite the crisis, we saw a record surge in minority-owned small business creation. So how can we make sure that as we build back, these businesses not only survive, but continue to grow? We want to thank our underwriter, PayPal, for their support of the Atlantic Festival and our journalism here at the Atlantic. And we want to remind all of you at home that you can participate in the conversation via the Q&A tab. Please tell us where you're from, and if you ask a question, we can add it to the conversation. Now, let's get started with our first session.
For a conversation on the federal response, please welcome Isabella Casillas Guzman, the U.S. Small Business Administrator, and Derek Thompson, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Hello, Administrator Guzman, welcome. I want to talk about the pandemic, entrepreneurship, small business, and I want to do this chronologically. So can we start at the beginning of the pandemic? Tell me what happened to small and medium businesses in early 2020 and how much the government response in March 2020, April 2020 helped to stanch the bleeding.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, I was in California at the time leading on small businesses and innovative startups in the state, and was able to witness firsthand really the impact that COVID-19 has had on our small businesses from the get-go. Many small businesses, especially those hard-hit impacted businesses that had to figure out how to close and work around with new operations or new ways of reaching their customers, were highly impacted, obviously taking huge hits on their revenues. And in the recent surveys have shown that from the very beginning, small businesses have continued to struggle, and recent surveys show that still 2/3 of small businesses said the pandemic had a moderate or large negative effect overall on their businesses. So what we saw was a lot of early closures for health and public safety measures that we saw through states throughout the country, having an impact on those small businesses. Today, we see that a lot of those businesses are still feeling the impact from the revenue. But what was important was that the federal government stepped in quickly, along with many states, to provide immediate relief to small businesses. And that ran the full gamut of trying to help support them as they adopted e-commerce and digital strategies, try to support them as they figured out how to reopen safely for their workforce, and give them that technical assistance that they needed, and of course the financial relief, which was really critical. The Paycheck Protection Program, an $800 billion program that was able to keep businesses open and their employees on payroll. And so that was one of the really important steps for small businesses to make that critical decision to keep on trying to survive during the time while we still battled COVID in the early stages. As it evolved in businesses and it lingered on, I think that's what was a continued challenge for small businesses. They had to either shut down their operations multiple times as surges continued to impact their local communities. They saw changes in behaviors, consumer behaviors, as the COVID pandemic changed, and people were either concerned about going out or more willing to go out. And as that fluctuated, they really needed additional support. So the COVID EIDL program, for example, and all those local and state grant programs is what really provided them additional capital to keep their businesses open and continue to try to pivot and adapt, as we saw so many of them do. I think technology really played a really key role. At least 3 out of 4 businesses said they adopted some sort of new digital tool. They had to figure out how to redefine their main streets. They became digital main streets, and they wanted to figure out new ways how to connect with their businesses, with their small businesses around them, so that they could together figure out ways to reinvigorate local economies together.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about what kind of businesses struggled the most? I wrote a lot, I remember, in early and mid 2020 about food and the food services industry. And so I can imagine a couple very different sort of businesses that might have very different outcomes in the pandemic. So you take, say, a bar that doesn't have a lot of interior ventilation, which is clearly going to struggle given the lockdowns, given the intelligence that we have now about how this virus spreads. Then you have some businesses that might be somewhat in the middle, maybe like a fast casual restaurant that still found a way to use technology to deliver their food. And then you have businesses that it seems to me did quite well in the early small businesses. They did quite well in the first few quarters of 2020, like grocery stores. Not all grocery stores, to be sure, but you had lots of people who weren't going to restaurants as often, so they were going to grocery stores more. So that's just sort of the breakdown that I remember reporting from within the sort of the food services industry. But can you give us a sense of where we really saw the crunch, who really suffered among small and medium businesses in 2020 versus some other categories that were more resilient?
Mm-hmm. And we saw the travel and tourism businesses obviously highly impacted. So our hotels, and then all the related food and beverage businesses, retail that was dependent on the attraction of tourism as well. They were all impacted. Gyms and salons, from hair salons to nail salons, all of them had some incredible impacts as people were more cautious about going out into those environments, just the consumer behavior, or as local governments had to respond to public health crises and force some closures. And so those businesses obviously had the longest period of time where their revenues were impacted. And not only that, but a lot of the smallest of the small entities who could not navigate and get relief, the sole proprietors or the small employers who just didn't have those right connections. And I think that's what you started to see as we progressed through is really a recognition, and the Biden-Harris administration in particular, of course, has been really focused on making sure that the smallest of the small entities across these hardest hit sectors and broadly were able to access relief to position themselves to survive the pandemic and move beyond into thriving. In addition, our underserved communities, people of color and women saw disparate impacts. Always our veterans in rural and low-income communities have historic barriers that limited some of those connections needed to access relief. So in 2021, we really tried to focus our efforts in the Biden-Harris administration on ensuring that we could get relief to all of our businesses and tailored the PPP programs to make sure 96% of the funds in PPP in 2021 went to those businesses that were smaller, 20 employees and under, with really high impact in rural and low-income communities as well.
Yeah, I'd love you to be specific on this point. You know, historically, minority-owned businesses have struggled during recessions. They've had less access to emergency capital for a variety of reasons. They're often overlooked by policymakers in Washington, D.C. What is the Biden-Harris administration's plan or ongoing policy toward ensuring that minority-owned businesses aren't overlooked again, even as Delta continues to impact their business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, immediately, of course, there's a heightened interest in trying to make sure that connectivity is there, because a lot of times it meant if you didn't have that already existing banking relationship or a great CPA or a lawyer to help connect you, then that's when you lacked that relief. So with the American Rescue Plan, of course, the priority on public health and making sure that we could battle COVID-19 to reopen our small businesses was number one. But in addition, the $60 billion of investments really helped our high impact industries, as well as created the Community Navigator pilot program. And this is a $100 million pilot that we're soon to be launching across the country as well, with trusted local partners and national partners who can better connect authentically to these communities to make sure that they have all the technical assistance and the connectivity to the ecosystem to make sure they get capital and get relief and are positioned for success. Because those inequities in our economy and those inefficiencies, frankly, with those barriers to capital and opportunity, have limited too large of a segment of our entrepreneurs, and that is detrimental to our economy. So we are hopeful that with that program, as well as the real focused design across all of our programs on making sure that we're meeting all of our small businesses where they are. And that means the correct outreach, of course, but in the design, making sure that it fits the needs of our small businesses. We're really pleased, of course, that with COVID Idle and the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, that we've been able to really tailor these programs to better serve all our diverse communities and underserved businesses.
Yeah, the full story of small and medium-sized businesses in 2020 and during the pandemic is one of crisis and response, but it's not just one of crisis and response. We also saw a historic surge of business formation in 2020. Tell us a little bit about what factors you think have contributed to that surge and what the state of that surge is right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add we continue to see that surge in 2021. Just the first quarter, we saw 3 million new business applications, and that's a 60% increase over last year,
Wow.
in fact. And so we're continuing to see businesses formed to take advantage of opportunities for growth or to reposition themselves in the marketplace. I think that with especially the investments in building back better and the bipartisan infrastructure deal, we can see that there are a lot of opportunities for small businesses to innovate, for small businesses to help build infrastructure, to make sure that they're a part of the supply chain resiliency. And we're positioning all of our programs to make sure that those businesses can access those opportunities, but also have the capital that they need to position themselves. And so within the reconciliation, Build Back Better agenda, we're seeing keen investments in opportunity advancements for small businesses around capital access, lending, investments, giving SBA some authority to do direct lending and fill those gaps in the marketplaces and make sure that small businesses have the capital they need to go after those federal contracts, to go after those opportunities in the supply chain, in the private sector as well, and to be able to fulfill their American dream of entrepreneurship as they look for opportunities during this pandemic.
Yeah, it seems to me that a huge contributor to the rise of business formation, to this sort of new and surprising and wonderful in many ways surge of entrepreneurship, isn't just the fact that crises can be sort of liquid moments of history where people start new things. It's also the fact that I think the remote work revolution has encouraged a lot of people, frankly, probably a lot of knowledge workers, or at least people interested in starting companies that are adjacent to internet products, to say, well, I'm here, I'm sitting at home, I'm working alone, I might as well work for myself alone. Maybe I can start something. Sometimes those people had been laid off or furloughed, but sometimes they were still employed and they just had an idea that they went out and got. I'm fascinated by the remote work revolution. I follow it very, very closely. I would love to know what you think about the remote work revolution and the degree to which you think that this sort of that this new norm for knowledge workers, not all workers, but some white collar workers, the degree to which you think that this new norm will be a continuing norm that will survive, hopefully, the Delta surge in the pandemic.
I think it's been proven out, and I think it'll continue to change the landscape of small business and entrepreneurship for sure. I mean, we saw such increased rates of sole proprietor formation as well. I mean, so people are trying to figure out how they can rethink their work and rethink what their contribution is in their professional lives. And so you did see a lot of people, shift away from their current jobs or even industries to try to rethink what they would want to do during pandemic and post. Of course, and especially with women, of course, women are starting businesses at the highest rates. And with those changes in the childcare impact and the education impact during COVID, a lot of them had to rethink what they were doing, and there's huge exits from the workforce. And so I think that as individuals try to pursue what their great idea is and the impact that they're going to have on their main street or globally with some new innovation, we will see that the flexibility of remote work, the connectivity globally through digital e-commerce and other avenues is really going to change the landscape for small businesses in America.
Yeah, the flexibility, the connectivity is fantastic. I think for a lot of people, the lack of a commute is wonderful. More time that they can spend with their families, more time that they can spend not sitting in a car in traffic. I see so many potential benefits to the remote work revolution. I'm interested in where you see potential risk. I see, for example, the fact that, I'm speaking to you right now from downtown New York City. I sometimes look around cities like New York or Washington, D.C., Boston, and look at these enormous skyscrapers and think, when are offices going to move back into them? And what does that mean for commercial real estate? Commercial real estate might not be a central concern necessarily, a top concern of yours, but give me a sense of what part of the remote work revolution you're keeping your eye on as a potential risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've really tried to step up our technical assistance for small businesses with this digital economy because they have to figure out new ways to connect with people, connect with their potential clients. And then a lot of time that's been online through social media during the pandemic. They've had to create all sorts of new pages and make sure that their business is positioned to connect with businesses, with these individuals. Our main streets are not bustling. That client may not walk in your door, but they're online, and you need to be able to figure out how to connect with them. So it's a shift in how they market, it's a shift in how they connect with their clients across the board. But not only that, since it is increasingly digital, cybersecurity is actually one of my big concerns, and what we're trying to push in the Biden-Harris administration is to make sure that our businesses are resilient when it comes to cyber attacks as they adopt these new digital technologies. And so we're working in partnership to make sure that they have the education that they need on that front, on the digital front. But in addition, of course, we're concerned about our business centers as well, and the small businesses that typically serve all those employees and those workforces that come out in both for lunches or happy hours. So we want to make sure that the businesses can get support to reposition their strategies, their operating model, and make sure that they can access those markets in new ways.
Yeah, I think that's all very, very important. I think that as the internet becomes a more important piece of infrastructure for workers, for remote workers, white collar and knowledge workers, unequal access to the internet is also, I believe, as you mentioned, going to be a pretty important issue, and especially unequal access to broadband between ethnicities in this country. So a lot to work on. A very full plate that you have with all these crises and opportunities hitting all at once. So, Administrator, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was really nice to speak with you.
My pleasure to speak with you as well. Thank you.
Next up, a session produced by our underwriter PayPal, Building Back Stronger, Empowering Small Businesses Today for Tomorrow.
The racial wealth gap measures the difference between what one owns and what they owe. For Black and brown people in America, particularly Black Americans, the racial wealth gap is 10 to 1 relative to white Americans.
The racial wealth gap is an important element of just social injustice and systemic racism that exists in our country. How can we expect this country to come together if anyone is being left out? How could we create generational wealth that could be passed on and on and on? And that's where we said, like, we've got to do way more than a couple of $1 million.
Less than 2% of all venture capital funding actually goes into entrepreneurs of color. And so it is very important for people like PayPal and others to invest in Black and Latinx funds that will directly invest in founders of color.
We work in communities that are among the most economically distressed in the country, and the PayPal deposit imports capital into these well-starved communities and gives them an opportunity to support their needs. Making sure that the economy works for everyone is in our collective interest. That's what closing the racial wealth gap will accomplish.
I think we all need to step up. We have an obligation to help. It's the right thing to do for our companies. It's the right thing to do for our communities, for our economy, honestly, for our country.
Hi, I'm Urrutia, CEO of Accion Opportunity Fund, one of the nation's leading nonprofit CDFIs. We provide access to capital, coaching, and networks to businesses mostly owned by people of color, women, and immigrants. AOF received a grant from PayPal last year to help support Black and underrepresented small businesses as they navigate through the pandemic. It's been almost 2 years since COVID began, and we're still dealing with its impacts, especially in underserved communities. Today, we're talking to a small business owner whose business was devastated by the economic shutdown and subsequent challenges. Despite these nearly insurmountable challenges, this tenacious woman kept her business alive. She pivoted with a lot of hustle, determination, and ingenuity, and reinvented her business at a time when everything turned upside down. She found a way to support Black entrepreneurs in her Oakland community. We'll learn how she kept her business running, current challenges she and other small businesses are facing as COVID moves into its second year, and how private companies, policymakers, and NGOs can provide continued support. It is my absolute honor to introduce a great customer, Rain Free, the owner of Red Door Catering. Good morning, Rain.
Good morning. Thank you so much.
Tell us about your business.
We're a full service catering and gifting company that has served the Bay Area community for the past 16 years. We pride ourselves on being environmentally friendly and also partnering with minority businesses and local producers.
So, as a catering business, how did you navigate the pandemic and keep your doors open? What was the most critical factor that allowed you to remain operational?
Well, when shelter in place went into effect, we basically lost all of our clients and had to lay off 80% of our team members. It was absolutely devastating. And I immediately reached out to mentors and other organizations that I've worked with in the past to ask for help and funding. We began preparing meals for families impacted by COVID, opened our kitchen for pop ups, and created a virtual catering division. Accion Opportunity Fund actually took a chance on us by allowing us to cater our first virtual gala, which was a huge success. We also received both first and second rounds of the PPP loan, which allowed us to rehire some of our staff, catch up on our rent, and also put upgrades needed for our new e-commerce division. It's with the support emotionally and financially, like organizations such as Accion Opportunity Fund, that has not only allowed us to keep our doors open, but really thrive.
From your perspective, what are the current challenges that most small business owners of color are facing currently, especially since we're still in the midst of this pandemic?
Black women-owned businesses are still viewed as unbankable, lacking collateral, verifiable credit history, which creates a great struggle to access capital in our dreams. Let's face it, the information is out there. Black women are still not accessing the capital they need to fund their businesses, let alone what's best for growth while still building high growth businesses. There are a ton of money moving in tech, an industry that celebrates failure, big risks, and bold vision. We could tilt this same mindset to the food and other non-tech businesses and change the notion of traditional risk. The pandemic has shed light on the struggles that we faced for years and also has created a momentum for a more equitable economy. We need to recognize that equity needs equity. And for those who want to move the needle, it requires investments beyond debt, but a blend of capital that includes grants and affordable, transparent financing. Organizations such as Accion Opportunity Fund and others are needed and are addressing these issues.
So, how are you supporting other Black entrepreneurs? And overall, how can others help? What's needed the most?
After sitting with the reality of what's happening and realizing that we often, Black-owned businesses, we often work in a bubble and we don't have thought partners or feel that our community is a place necessarily to make mistakes or ask for help, I decided to create a space for Black food makers to supercharge our talents and create our own ecosystem, which led to the birth of the Culinary Collective, an incubator with goals of familiarizing Black entrepreneurs with best practices in regards to running their businesses and ways to access capital. They have access to our commercial kitchen 24 hours at an affordable rate, and also mentorship and linking them with organizations that could support them. So, what we really need right now is continued support from our local government, mentorship, technology, and also affordable loans.
COVID's shown a light on some of the flaws that have long plagued our financial system. Small businesses are the fabric of our communities, and investing in them increases their financial health, creates jobs, and drives economic activity in communities across our country. It will require strong partnerships between the public, private, and government sectors to provide the resources small businesses need to rebuild and regenerate our main streets. If those listening have any needs for the best catering and gift boxes for your in-person or virtual events, please give Grain Free a try. Thank you.
For a conversation on corporate America's role, please welcome Aurora James, founder of the 15% Pledge and founder and creative director, Brother Vellies, and Susan Salney, contributor, Atlantic Live.
Hi, Aurora. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
Great. So let's start by going back to last summer. It's just after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and you had an idea about equity, businesses, and accountability, took to Instagram and started a campaign that has evolved into a change-making nonprofit called the 15% Pledge. Tell us more about your idea and what the pledge aims to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, like so many of us, I was seeing all of these messages from major corporations and retailers that were saying, Black Lives Matter and I stand with Black people. And while I was reading it, I wasn't necessarily feeling it. And I decided to launch a call to action for major retailers to commit 15% of their shelf space to Black-owned businesses. So I put that out there into the world on May 29th. By day 10, Sephora became the first major corporation to commit to the 15% pledge. And over the past 18 months, we've announced 28 major corporations and retailers that have committed to the 15% pledge. Most recently was Nordstrom. They actually signed a 10-year contract with our organization. And because of all of this, we've actually driven over $10 billion worth of opportunity to Black-owned businesses across this country.
That's an incredible effort to make more equitable market share for those Black-owned businesses. It's been a year of tremendous growth for your organization, obviously. Can you tell us about the past year and how receptive or not you found some of the big retailers to the idea of the 15%? Which doesn't sound like a big request. In other words, what are you learning about the diversity of retail and corporate America as you try to bring more companies to the pledge?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Susan. When I launched the pledge, I actually had no idea what the average shelf space really was. And I knew it wasn't close to 15%, but once we actually started doing some digging and understanding how much of people's procurement budget was actually going to Black-owned businesses, we see that largely it's below 3%, and for a lot of businesses hovering around 1%. So, it's definitely a pretty major proposition, but, we're also not asking anyone to do this overnight. In fact, we want people to take time, do it thoughtfully, and meticulously, and make sure that they're really finding Black-owned businesses that are right for them, because not only do we want people to be doing the right thing, we want people to be doing good business at the same time.
Right, right. The Gap, Macy's, Sephora, as you mentioned, these are just a few of the national retailers who have taken the pledge. And it's not just lip service, it comes with some pretty deep commitments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's been a trend where you're seeing these businesses make one-time donations, right? Or $2 million to the NAACP, for example, which is amazing and incredible. And obviously that level of philanthropy is super important, especially coming from someone who runs a nonprofit myself. But, we really need long-term accountable change. And I think what's so important about the work that we're doing at the 15% pledge is that these retailers are actually signing contracts with us, and we're checking in every quarter, and we're making sure that we're really working together as partners to make sure that they're getting access to the pipeline of Black-owned businesses that make sense for them, and that they're actually seeing growth, and that we can kind of troubleshoot any issues that are happening along the way.
And I read that one important aim of the initiative is to help close the racial wealth gap by helping Black businesses tap into the venture capital needed to scale up, advertise, and be more visible. As a business owner yourself, can you speak to why that's so important? This idea, it's a little bit beyond shelf space, that tapping into the capital.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, I'm a small business owner myself. I started my accessories brand, Brother Vellies, with $3,500 at a flea market in the Lower East Side of New York City, and had no access to capital. Everyone says entrepreneurs should raise money from friends and family, but what happens when your friends and family don't have additional resources to put your way? So, one thing that I'm super excited about in this work that we've been doing with the pledge is really connecting Black entrepreneurs with a lot of the different resources that they need. And look, there's also not a lot of trust, right? Like, I'm talking to Black entrepreneurs every single day that are like, oh, like this private equity company or this VC reached out to us, and I don't want to lose my business, so I don't really want to even get back to them. So we really need that whole face of the financial industry to really change as well, if we're going to start connecting these dots. And ultimately, the 15% pledge is a $1 trillion proposition, and so we're going to have a lot of economic resources flowing into the Black communities in order to get to where we need to go and have a more sustainable and equitable country.
That's right. Now, what impact do you think the diversification of in-store offerings has on businesses that are used to, say, business as usual? And what about the impact on customers of all races?
Well, I have to tell you, the best news that we've gotten so far from the companies that have taken the pledge is that not only is this a great thing to do, it's actually just great business. Sephora, Rent the Runway, they're two of our earliest pledge takers, and they're seeing already that it's having really great returns. And I think when we look at consumer spending, and also all of these retailers, actual consumers, there's a clear need and demand for this sort of diversity to happen on the shelves. And I think that it's giving us better access to a broader range of products. Everyone says, the feedback sometimes we'll get about the pledge is, well, shouldn't stores just be stocking the best product? And my response to that is, yes, absolutely. And so we need these measures to make sure that they're looking and finding some of the best product that has been historically overlooked.
Right. Variation of products is a good thing in itself, right? It pays off, as you just said. But let's go back to about 2 weeks ago. You took fashion's biggest night, the Met Gala, to design a white gown for Representative Ocasio-Cortez with a message blazed across the back that said, "Tax the rich." Now, you're an acclaimed designer using your platform to raise awareness this way. What fuels your passion for doing that?
Listen, the Congresswoman has always had messages of her own that she's put at the forefront of her campaigns. And I think for me, as a fashion designer, I'm someone who really wants to support women tell their story, tell their message, and feel confident and feel really proud. And I think that's something that we did that night, and getting her message out there to a wide audience. And, it was definitely received on quite a quite a wide scale.
We've been talking about businesses, but what can individual consumers do to use spending power wisely in regard to equity and market share?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. I think so often we'll kind of be sitting at home, especially during the pandemic, and say, like, how can I help? What can I do? And, at the 15% pledge, we also urge consumers to take a look at their own spending, right? And say, like, okay, can I make sure that I'm spending 15% of my own budget in Black owned businesses? And even for me, it's been about like looking in my closet, looking in my refrigerator, looking at all of my spending. Even the restaurants that I'm getting takeout from or visiting, and making sure that I'm supporting Black owned businesses that are close to me as well. And one of our pledge takers, Yelp, did something super amazing last year by actually adding the Black owned business filter so that everyone across America can actually search for the Black owned businesses in their own communities to support, which has been so awesome.
Your website includes a database of businesses for gift ideas and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, so we actually have been building a super robust database of Black owned businesses over the past 18 months, and we haven't rolled out the full thing publicly yet. Right now, it's only available to our pledge takers. But leading up to the holiday season, we're going to be publishing a lot of gift guides and just making sure to introduce people to Black owned businesses. And we spend a ton of time doing that on social media as well. So for anyone that's listening that wants to, learn about new Black owned businesses, make sure that you follow the 15% pledge on Instagram and our newsletter as well.
Great. Is your ultimate goal to influence enough companies to be intentional about creating space for Black business owners and owners of color, that there won't be a need for something like the 15% pledge in the future?
Absolutely. My goal basically is to, get the organization to a place where people are like, wait, why did we ever even need that? And I think that it seems like such a no-brainer for people. But in reality, I told you the numbers earlier, a lot of these businesses have a long way to go. And, of course, I'm incredibly proud of the 30 or so pledge takers that we've announced publicly to date. But there are still so many more that I think could do such a great job taking the pledge and really cultivating their own group of Black owned businesses. And, I'm excited to see who's going to come to the table next and make this commitment.
Are there other areas of the private sector you'd hope to influence?
Yeah, of course, Silicon Valley. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? It's like we definitely need capital to start going to these businesses. We also haven't seen anyone take the pledge in the grocery space yet. Would love for an Instacart or a Kroger to really step up in that way, because obviously, that industry could use the support so much. There's been, such a history of crop sharing and, Black farmers being really exploited across this country, and really, regaining some of that momentum in that space for Black entrepreneurs, I think would be absolutely wonderful.
So you think all of that's next to the pledge. I guess you envision another year of tremendous growth, just like the past year?
Yes, another year of tremendous growth for sure. Just since this year started, we've already onboarded over 385 Black owned businesses onto our pledge takers shelves, which is pretty incredible. But, to be honest with you, Susan, in order to get all of our retailers to 15%, we're going to need to quadruple that number of Black owned businesses. We're going to need to be able to get them all of the resources they need to scale and be successful. So, there is a lot of work ahead of us, not just for me, for everyone at the 15% Pledges nonprofit organization, and honestly, also for everyone that's listening as well.
Well, thank you so much for sharing these ideas, Aurora. We'll end on that note. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Susan.
Pleasure.
For our final session about access to capital, please welcome Robert F. Smith, founder, chairman, and CEO of Vista Equity Partners. Derek Thompson is back to lead the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us, Robert. Let's jump right in. So the pandemic was obviously awful for so many small business owners, especially minority business owners. And before we dive into the pandemic's impact and some of the long-term plans that we have to make sure nothing like this happens again, can you briefly explain to us the history of why minority-owned businesses have historically been deprived of access to capital?
Yeah, there's again, in the U.S., really hundreds of years of policy and action that has deprived the specifically African American community of capital and wherewithal to develop infrastructure for economic improvement. It started with from the Homestead Act to the Southern Homestead Act to the way that redlining worked to the way that the GI Bill was disproportionately distributed in terms of opportunity when our soldiers returned from war. And as a result of that systemic underdevelopment and undercapitalization of the community has always plagued our communities. Even today, 70% of African American communities don't have a branch bank. And if you think about development of a business or community, you need capital. And if you don't have access to capital, i.e. access to a bank or banking services or the solutions that capital brings, then it's going to be hard for you to really regenerate any economic activity in that community, including job regeneration, et cetera.
Right. So after the pandemic or during the first months of the pandemic, you approached the Trump administration and Congress and asked them to earmark an additional $10 billion for community development in financial institutions to sustain minority-owned small businesses. Tell me a little bit about your conversation with sort of key stakeholders in Washington, what you were really trying to do there and what you accomplished.
Sure. I'll tell you what came out of the analysis that my companies were doing on how this pandemic was affecting small to medium businesses. We have 1.4 million small businesses as customers across our platform of 70 plus companies. And one of our businesses actually is a company called Finastra. It provides banking solutions to large, medium, and small banks globally. One of the fourth largest enterprise software companies or fintech companies in the world. And the team brought to my attention a couple of elements. One was that the way that people were utilizing what was in the PPP loans, and we were just seeing there was just actually no access for these small to medium businesses in these African American Latino communities to that facility. And so as we really started to dig in deeply, we started talking to everyone from the NAACP to the Urban League and found and really discovered, that's when the discovery came of, how little those organizations, those communities were being banked by the large banking institutions. And so my team jumped right on it and started really building solutions and systems to aid these small to medium businesses and gaining access to the PPP loans. Well, then, of course, when that first rush went through, the money got used up quickly. So then I called Secretary Mnuchin and said, listen, I think we're going to have a problem if we don't actually earmark some capital for these small lenders into these small communities, because these companies typically don't have but days of working capital, not months of working capital. And when they shut down and they can no longer receive customers, that was a problem. So, that led to a whole series of dynamics and conversations with Senator Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and other folks to really drive forward, an initiative that said, let's carve out capital so these small to medium businesses have access. Point one. Point two, my companies then jumped on it and said, let's make sure that these small banks have the capacity to actually process these loans. And, prior to doing these loans, these companies, would do, 30, 40, 50 loans in a year, these banks. And, once we implemented these software and technology solutions, they were able to do hundreds and process hundreds and thousands of loans in weeks. That's the power of technology, obviously. So combining those forces of technology, connectivity, and then of course, capital and earmarked capital really helped give these small to medium businesses some boost during this horrific time of the pandemic, the early stages of it.
Right. So did it work? Did these policies work in terms of extending funds to minority-owned companies that were otherwise not going to receive anything from PPP after the money ran out?
Yeah, it absolutely did. And, I always point to this one's a great example. Hope Credit Union, which is really in the Delta, parts of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. prior to modernization and the capital, call it, the capital sequestering for this community. I mean, they did 60 business loans the prior year. They then did 7,500 business loans over 3 months, utilizing technology platforms and capital. And you have to remember, the average loan for them was $11,000. So these aren't huge loans, but they make a huge difference to these small businesses that typically employ 1, 2, 3, 5 people in those communities. So if you think about it, it's saving 30, 40, 50,000 jobs and enabling that bank and that credit union to now process more effectively loans going forward once they became modernized. And so we've been able to actually continue to push that through. I'm trying to get now the administration to really carve out some capital to ensure all the CDFIs and MDIs, which are community finance development institutions and minority depository institutions, modernize. Only we're going to take $500 million out of a $3 trillion plan. And if we're able to do that, that's going to create a massive economic uplift for all of these communities that rely on these CDFIs and MDIs for capital sources.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me how crises can kickstart innovation and invention that wouldn't necessarily otherwise exist without the impetus of the crisis. I wrote a feature for The Atlantic last year about how the skyscraper was invented in Chicago just years after the Great Fire of Chicago, in large part because after Chicago was flattened, you had all of these architects who came in to rebuild it, and they came up with steel skeletons construction in New York. After the Great Blizzard of the 1880s, New York built its first subway because they wanted to bring the elevated trains underground so they couldn't be shut down by another blizzard. It seems like in lots of cases, this pandemic has had some similar examples that we have learned things or been sort of motivated to innovate in ways we might otherwise not have, in the sort of way that makes us want to carry this forward. Okay, if that worked, maybe we should keep doing it with or without a pandemic. So tell me a little bit about how what you learned might point us toward a viable plan going forward for extending funds to minority-owned businesses.
I think one of the most important things we can do is really, focus and emphasize on the importance of the corporate, and I'll call it private and public partnership that we were able to forge during that time, and say, okay, now how do we extend it? And part of what I'm doing is working with the Business Roundtable and Edison Alliance at World Economic Forum and saying, okay, listen, we as corporations, beyond capital, what we actually have is wherewithal, knowledge, organizational capacity, and pretty smart people, right, who work in our organizations. And so let's direct them towards the problems that we know our society has. And when I think about, in America, at least, one of the biggest issues we have is how do we enable our overall workforce to be more competitive in a digital economy? Well, first thing, we have to get broadband, right? So let's get a broadband network to every American, as opposed to, Americans that don't live in, specific communities. 82% of HBCUs, for instance, are in broadband deserts, which is just horrible. So now you have a whole, group of African-American students who want to learn, but now they're in a broadband desert, and it frankly is an inhibitor to them participating in the digital economy fully. Well, one of the initiatives we started was a Student Freedom Initiative, and as part of that, now have Cisco Systems, ABC Technologies, which is all what we now are combining. We're building out entire broadband networks for every single HBCU. Well, beyond what that does for the students, it now creates extensibility into the community, because once you have broadband, you have the ability to use software solutions for small to medium businesses. You can do things in education for distance learning management systems. You can also focus on telemedicine as a way to deliver, low cost, high quality, healthcare solutions to the community. So you got to build out those infrastructures, but again, public-private partnerships, and now working, of course, trying to get the administration to also understand the importance of funding and supporting these sort of initiatives, because that creates a backbone of opportunity for all Americans to now participate in the digital economy, which helps the entire economy. So those are some of the initiatives we're focused on at this point.
Yeah, you have two more progressive funding models I want to talk about, the 2% solution and the Southern Cities Initiative. Just tell me about both of those briefly.
Sure. So the Southern Communities Initiative really is that, when you think about it, 60% of African-American communities live, actually, believe it or not, within a 100-mile radius of 6 cities. And so we're focusing on those 6 cities. We're bringing a number of things to them. First, of course, is the broadband infrastructure to the HBCUs. The second is, how do we bring capacity to the CDFIs and MDIs? So these are the capillary banking systems, modernizing them, in addition to looking to bring, very expansive forms of capital, tier one capital into that construct. Point three, how do you then take that and make that more extensible, not only into learning, but also into the development of the small to medium business segment. So small, businesses, when they utilize enterprise software tools, they get a 900% ROI. So you can just start thinking about layers on top of layers. And once you have broadband infrastructure, you can do all sorts of things in telemedicine and wellness. This is an initiative that came out of some work that we did at the Business Roundtable. And then I've had, two people, Rich Lesser, CEO of BCG, and Dan Schulman, who's the CEO of PayPal, say, hey, let's do this together. And now we're bringing resources into these 6 communities, which include local partners. For instance, Walton Foundation's involved. We've got the King Center in Atlanta involved. And these are the sort of local partners that we're now leveraging with the Grameen America, for instance, to now create 500 and 1,000 small businesses, startups by African Americans in these communities that are getting funded and have the ability to now grow. These are the sorts of initiatives that we're driving forward in concert that came out of a pandemic that gave realization and recognition to the disparities of wealth and opportunity, probably most importantly in a lot of communities. So that's one of the initiatives we're focused on.
Yeah, you talked about closing the broadband deficit. You talked about closing an education deficit and access to finance deficit. I'm also interested in the trust deficit. Communities of color have a lot of reasons not to trust big banks, not to trust the financial sector, frankly, not to trust a lot of big institutions. What are ways that we can help to build back that trust in addition to everything that you've covered?
Yeah, again, so what I'm encouraging, which kind of touches on the 2% solution, is encouraging the large corporations to rebuild the trust through capital. If they just donated, again, kind of 2% of their net income for the next 10 years, we can basically solve the wealth and the income disparity in all the communities in the US. That 2% to create jobs, create sustainable opportunities. One inspired idea came through Bank of America, and with Ann Finucane and John Utendahl, and said they created now an Equality Progress Sustainability Bond. In essence, these companies can now issue this bond, take that capital and deliver it across these various initiatives, which can be, the upgrading of the HBCU infrastructure to, powering, venture capital or small to medium business capital solutions, or put tier one capital and CDFIs into these communities. That's an inspired solution that came out of, if you think about it, a crisis. And now we have technical solutions, i.e. in the form of financial market solutions that can now change the dynamic and trajectory of not only a company, but a neighborhood and a community. That's how you build that trust back. That's a way to say, listen, we are actually taking profits and capacity that we have, organizational capacity, learning, knowledge, and driving it into communities that we know don't have access to this, but will actually improve the station in life and the dimension of opportunity for that community. So those are some of the ways that are important that we need to.
That's great. Yeah, last question for you is, sometimes people say that the Atlantic can be a little bit too Washington, D.C. focused. So I apologize, because this is a question that's very much focused on Washington policy. Right now, Congress and the Senate, the White House are debating an infrastructure bill. There's been a lot of debate over what we should consider infrastructure to be put into this bill, whether it's not just roads and bridges that are considered infrastructure, I think, among people who are broad-minded. Broadband is also infrastructure. Healthcare, to a certain extent, can also be infrastructure. What is one item, one element that is on the fringes of this bill, or possibly, going to be included in this bill, that you think is most essential to solving the problems that you've been fixated on solving for the last few years?
If I could pick one thing, I'm going to tell you I want to. But the first thing would be that they need to upgrade the infrastructure for the CDFIs and MDIs. And it's $500 million to upgrade and modernize every CDFI and MDI, what creates lending capacity in every community in the United States. Now, when you have that, you now have the ability to push capital in the communities. The second thing would be broadband. We have about 42 million Americans who really don't have access to broadband. And I look over in India and what, Mukesh Ambani's done. He's got 1.3 billion people who now have access to broadband. There's about 400 million who use it. And if we can't get those 42 million people access to broadband, effective broadband, that's a problem. Those are the two things. You solve those two problems, and that creates a massive economic uplift for all communities in America.
Access to broadband, access to capital. Sounds like a good formula. Robert, thank you so, so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it.
Eric, thank you so much. Good to see you.
And that concludes this hour of programming. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation, and thank you again to PayPal for supporting the Atlantic Festival. We have much more in store for you today. Please take a look at the schedule for more information, and we'll see you soon.
While we're on a break, we encourage you to network with other attendees and visit our expo booths. To participate, select the networking icon located on the left-hand side of the screen. Next, click Join, and you'll be randomly paired with another attendee for about 5 minutes. If you wish, you can exchange virtual information with each other and keep in contact via direct message within the platform. You can also click the Explore icon to visit our virtual expo booths. Here you can explore more resources from the Atlantic and our underwriters related to today's event. We'll see you shortly after the break.